The photographs landed on Hermann Göring's desk in the early months of 1942, and the Reichsmarshal's reaction was immediate and decisive. He laughed, not a polite chuckle or a knowing smile, but genuine, belly-deep laughter that echoed through the ornate halls of the Reich Air Ministry in Berlin. The intelligence officers who had delivered the images of America's newest fighter stood uncomfortably as Göring slid the photographs across his polished mahogany desk toward Adolf Galland, the fighter ace who would soon become general of fighters for the entire Luftwaffe. "Look at this monstrosity," Göring said, his multiple chins wobbling with amusement. "The Americans have built a flying pig." Galland picked up the photographs with the careful attention of a professional warrior studying an enemy weapon. His eyes moved across the images, taking in the bulbous nose, the thick wings, the overall massive appearance of the aircraft. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt looked nothing like the sleek, deadly fighters that had given Germany air superiority across Europe. It looked heavy, ungainly, almost comically oversized for a single-seat fighter. "It weighs over 7 tons, Galland observed, reading from the intelligence summary attached to the photographs. "That's nearly twice what our Bf-109s weigh in combat configuration. The Americans are sending their pilots to war in an aircraft that's fundamentally unsuited for air combat." The other officers in the room nodded in agreement. Everything they knew about fighter design, everything they had learned through years of combat experience across Spain, Poland, France, and Britain, told them that this American aircraft was doomed. Weight was the enemy of performance in a fighter. Every kilogram added meant reduced speed, reduced maneuverability, reduced climb rate. An aircraft that weighed 15,000 pounds fully loaded could not possibly compete with German fighters that weighed half that much. It was simple physics, and physics was not subject to negotiation or national pride. "Too heavy," Göring declared with the absolute certainty of a man who believed himself to be militarily infallible. "Too slow. Too clumsy to matter in real aerial combat. Our pilots will shoot them down like clay pigeons at a hunting estate." He pushed the photographs away dismissively, already moving on to other matters. "The Americans still don't understand air warfare the way we do. Let them waste their industrial capacity building these elephants. It will only make our victories easier." The intelligence assessment that accompanied those photographs reinforced the dismissive attitude. The P-47 was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP radial engine, a massive power plant that produced impressive horsepower but created an unavoidably bulky frontal profile. Radial engines, with their cylinders arranged in a circle around the crankshaft, were inherently wider than the sleek inline engines used by most German fighters. This gave the P-47 a portly, almost ungraceful appearance that seemed entirely inappropriate for an aircraft that would need to dogfight against the Luftwaffe's best. German tactical doctrine for engaging the P-47 was developed based on these assessments, and it seemed perfectly logical given what was known. Force the American fighters into turning engagements where superior German maneuverability would dominate. Avoid extended straight-line pursuits where the Thunderbolt's powerful engine might provide some advantage. Get in close, use the nimbleness of the Bf-109 or FW-190 to gain a tail position, and dispatch the heavy American fighter with a quick burst of cannon fire. The P-47 appeared to be exactly the kind of target that experienced Luftwaffe pilots had been destroying for years. But in the spring of 1943, when the first P-47 Thunderbolts began arriving in England and flying combat missions over occupied Europe, something unexpected happened. The aircraft that German generals had laughed at began teaching the Luftwaffe lessons that would be written in blood across the skies of Europe. The first combat encounters were startling, confusing, and deeply concerning to German tactical analysts. Hauptmann Johannes Naumann, leading a flight of Focke-Wulf 190s against American fighters over northern France, positioned his formation for what should have been a textbook engagement: altitude advantage, perfect positioning, experienced pilots, superior aircraft. Every factor favored the Germans. Naumann rolled into his attack dive, lining up on a P-47 that seemed to be flying straight and level, apparently unaware of the danger diving toward it from above. But as Naumann's finger moved toward the firing button, the American pilot suddenly rolled his massive fighter and dove. And what happened next contradicted everything German pilots had been taught about the relationship between aircraft weight and performance. The P-47 didn't just dive, it plummeted with shocking acceleration, pulling away from Naumann's Focke-Wulf despite the German fighter's reputation for excellent dive performance. Naumann pushed his throttle to maximum power, pointed his nose down as steeply as he dared, and watched in disbelief as the American aircraft continued to extend the distance between them. That 7-ton weight that had seemed like such a fatal disadvantage was actually providing a tremendous advantage in vertical maneuvers. When a Thunderbolt pilot pushed the stick forward and pointed the nose toward the Earth, physics took over in ways that the German analysts had not anticipated. The massive aircraft accelerated like a falling boulder, achieving speeds that lighter fighters could not safely match without risking structural failure or compressibility effects that made the controls useless. Naumann pulled out of his dive, having learned a crucial lesson that would be repeated in countless engagements over the coming months. The P-47 could not be caught in a dive. German pilots who tried to escape American fighters by diving, a tactic that had worked effectively against Spitfires and Hurricanes, found themselves being overtaken by Thunderbolts that seemed to defy the fundamental laws of aerial combat. But the dive performance was only the first surprise. The second was even more disturbing from the German perspective, and it struck at the very heart of how air combat had been fought since the beginning of powered flight. Fighters were fragile. Everyone knew this. They had to be fragile because making them strong enough to absorb significant damage meant adding weight that reduced performance. A good burst of cannon fire would destroy or cripple any fighter. Pilots who took hits either died immediately or struggled to nurse their damaged aircraft back to friendly territory, assuming they made it at all. The P-47 Thunderbolt broke that fundamental assumption. Oberst Josef Priller, commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, one of the Luftwaffe's elite fighter wings, sent a report to headquarters that was initially dismissed as exaggeration or pilot error. His men had engaged P-47s over the French coast, scored multiple confirmed hits with 20mm cannon fire, and watched in shock as the American fighters continued flying as if the damage was merely cosmetic. Priller personally observed an engagement where a Thunderbolt took hits from 3 different German fighters, was visibly trailing smoke from the engine area, had holes punched through both wings, and still managed to shoot down one of his pilots before departing the combat area at high speed. "This is unlike anything we have encountered," Priller wrote in his after-action report. "Our standard tactics assume that a fighter which has absorbed this level of damage is either destroyed or critically crippled. The Thunderbolt appears to operate under different rules. We need to reconsider our engagement protocols." When these reports reached Göring, his response was predictable. He blamed the pilots. The Luftwaffe was getting soft, he declared. Pilots were making excuses for their failures instead of pressing home their attacks with the necessary aggression. No fighter could absorb that kind of punishment and continue fighting. It was physically impossible, and therefore the reports must be wrong. But the reports were not wrong. They were describing a new reality of air combat, one that had been deliberately engineered into the P-47 by Alexander Kartveli and his design team at Republic Aviation. While German designers had optimized for maneuverability and speed by minimizing weight, the American designers had taken a radically different approach. They had built survivability into the aircraft's fundamental structure. The massive Pratt & Whitney radial engine was not just powerful, it was inherently more damage-resistant than inline engines. When bullets or shells struck a radial engine, they might destroy 1 or 2 cylinders, but the remaining cylinders could often continue producing enough power to keep the aircraft flying. Inline engines, elegant and streamlined as they were, tended to fail catastrophically when damaged because hits to the cooling system or crankcase would quickly lead to engine seizure. The P-47's fuel tanks incorporated self-sealing technology that German aircraft also used, but the American implementation was more robust. When bullets punctured the tanks, the rubber lining would swell and close the holes, preventing catastrophic fuel loss and dramatically reducing the risk of fire. The cockpit had armor plating that actually provided meaningful protection to the pilot, not just token armor that made pilots feel slightly better but offered little real defense. The entire airframe was built with redundancy in critical systems and structural strength that allowed it to absorb damage that would have caused structural failure in lighter fighters. American pilot Robert Johnson became a living testament to the P-47's incredible durability during an engagement that would become legendary among Thunderbolt pilots. Flying with the 56th Fighter Group, Johnson's P-47 was attacked by Focke-Wulf 190s flown by some of Germany's most skilled pilots. The German fighters raked his aircraft with cannon and machine gun fire, shredding the fuselage, shattering the canopy, damaging flight controls, and wounding Johnson himself. By any reasonable assessment, that aircraft should have fallen from the sky in pieces. Instead, Johnson maintained control, nursed the badly damaged Thunderbolt across the English Channel, and made an emergency landing at his base. When ground crews examined his aircraft, they stopped counting the holes after reaching 200. The P-47 looked like it had been through an industrial shredder. The fact that it had flown at all, much less made a controlled landing, seemed to defy the laws of physics and engineering. Photographs of Johnson's damaged aircraft circulated among P-47 units, and rather than frightening pilots, the images had the opposite effect. They proved that the Thunderbolt would bring you home even when everything went wrong. The aircraft developed a reputation for toughness that became self-reinforcing. Pilots who trusted their aircraft flew more aggressively, pressed attacks with greater confidence, and took calculated risks that pilots in more fragile fighters would have avoided. That psychological advantage translated directly into combat effectiveness. German pilots, meanwhile, were learning hard lessons about what it took to actually destroy a P-47. A few hits were not enough. Even a good burst that would have downed any other fighter might only damage a Thunderbolt without removing it from the fight. To reliably kill a P-47, German pilots needed sustained, accurate fire, which meant staying committed to the attack for longer periods, which exposed them to counterattack from other American fighters. The Thunderbolt's durability created tactical dilemmas that German pilots had never faced before. Adolf Galland, whose initial dismissal of the P-47 had been so confident, was forced to revise his tactical guidance to Luftwaffe fighter units. "Do not underestimate the Thunderbolt," his new directives warned. "It cannot outturn German fighters in horizontal maneuvering, but it will outdive anything in our inventory. Its firepower is devastating. Its ability to absorb battle damage exceeds any fighter we have previously encountered. Engage only from positions of clear advantage, and ensure kills rather than assuming that a few hits will be sufficient." The 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns mounted in the P-47's wings were another nasty surprise for German pilots. Luftwaffe fighters typically carried a mix of machine guns and cannons, with the cannons providing the real killing power but carrying limited ammunition. The P-47's 850 calibers provided a different kind of threat. Each gun was a heavy weapon capable of destroying aircraft, and with 8 of them firing simultaneously, the combined stream of fire was like flying into a metal storm. German pilots who survived being targeted by a P-47 described the experience in visceral terms. The tracers seemed to fill the sky. The sound of rounds impacting their aircraft was like being inside a drum during a hailstorm. Aircraft that flew through the concentrated fire from all 8 guns didn't just get damaged. They came apart, wings separated from fuselages, tail sections were shot away, engines exploded, cockpits became death traps as heavy rounds punched through aluminum and flesh with equal ease. Major Heinz Baer, one of Germany's leading aces with over 200 victories, witnessed a Messerschmitt caught by P-47 fire during an engagement over Germany. In his combat report, he described watching the entire tail section of the Messerschmitt separate from the aircraft after less than 2 seconds of concentrated fire from a Thunderbolt. The fighter, which had been maneuvering desperately a moment before, instantly transformed into tumbling debris falling toward the earth. The pilot never had a chance to bail out. The psychological impact of the P-47's firepower was significant. German pilots learned to recognize the sound and sight of 850 calibers firing, and they learned to fear it. When you heard that distinctive roar, when you saw those 8 streams of tracers converging, the only rational response was immediate evasive action. Pilots who hesitated or who tried to absorb the fire while lining up their own shots rarely survived the exchange. Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, recognized exactly what he had in the P-47 and trained his pilots accordingly. "Don't try to dogfight with Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs in horizontal turning engagements," he instructed. "Use energy tactics instead. Start with altitude advantage. Dive on the enemy using the P-47's superior dive performance. Make a high-speed slashing attack with those 8 guns. Then, use the momentum from the dive to climb back to altitude before the Germans can respond. Fight the battle on your terms, using your advantages while avoiding situations where your weaknesses matter. This tactical approach, which would later be refined and formalized by pilots like Colonel Dave Schilling and Ace Francis Gabby Gabreski, transformed the P-47 from a potentially mediocre dogfighter into a devastating air superiority weapon. German pilots found themselves unable to force Thunderbolts into the kind of fight where German aircraft had advantages. The Americans would simply refuse to engage in turning battles, instead using speed and altitude to dictate when and how combat occurred. By mid-1943, the laughter had stopped completely in German briefing rooms. The P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer a joke or a curiosity. It was a serious threat that was taking an increasing toll on Luftwaffe fighter strength. But the worst was yet to come, because the Americans were about to demonstrate that the Thunderbolt was not just an escort fighter. It was also the most devastating ground attack aircraft the German military had ever faced. The P-47's large, sturdy airframe could carry significant external loads. A single Thunderbolt could haul up to 2,500 pounds of bombs on external racks beneath the wings and fuselage, nearly matching the bomb load of early war medium bombers. It could carry 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, fearsome weapons that could destroy tanks and fortified positions. And even after expending all external ordnance, it still had those .850 caliber machine guns for strafing runs that could tear through trucks, trains, and troops with horrifying effectiveness. German forces on the ground quickly learned to fear the distinctive sound of P-47s overhead. Supply convoys attempting to move materials to the front lines during daylight became suicide missions. Thunderbolts would appear seemingly from nowhere, diving from high altitude at speeds that made them nearly impossible to track with anti-aircraft fire. They would release their bombs with devastating accuracy, obliterating trucks and bridges and fuel dumps. They would fire their rockets, sending 5-inch projectiles screaming into tanks and bunkers. And then they would make strafing runs, those 8 machine guns methodically destroying everything that had survived the initial onslaught. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding German forces in the West, watched his logistics network systematically dismantled by Allied air power, with P-47s featuring prominently in that destruction. Movements that should have taken hours stretched into days as units were forced to hide during daylight and travel only at night. Even nighttime movement offered no guarantee of safety, as some P-47 units began flying night interdiction missions, hunting for German convoys by moonlight or using rudimentary night fighting techniques. General Gunther von Kluge, who would later command Army Group West during the critical period after D-Day, sent increasingly desperate messages about the impact of Allied air power on German ground operations. His forces could not maneuver freely. Tactical movements that should have been simple became complex and dangerous. The P-47 in particular earned specific mention in his reports. Its combination of heavy bomb loads, rocket armament, and devastating machine gun fire made it uniquely dangerous to ground forces. Railway systems, critical for moving troops and supplies across occupied Europe, became priority targets for P-47 ground attack missions. Thunderbolt pilots developed tactics specifically for attacking trains, diving on locomotives to destroy them with bombs or rockets, then strafing the rail cars to destroy cargo and kill personnel. A single successful attack could tie up an entire railway line for days, while damaged rolling stock was cleared and tracks were repaired. The cumulative effect was catastrophic for German logistics. Artillery positions, which had traditionally been relatively safe behind the front lines, suddenly found themselves vulnerable to air attack. P-47s could identify artillery positions by their muzzle flashes or by intelligence reports, then attack with bombs and rockets before the guns could be moved to new positions. German artillery commanders found themselves constantly displacing their weapons, reducing their effectiveness, and exhausting their crews, all to avoid the threat of Thunderbolt attacks. The P-47's rugged construction, which made it so survivable in air-to-air combat, provided similar advantages in the ground attack role. Anti-aircraft fire was a constant threat to any aircraft operating at low altitude, and German forces deployed extensive flak defenses ranging from small-caliber automatic weapons to heavy 88mm guns. All of these weapons would engage Allied aircraft attempting ground attack missions, and the sky would fill with tracers and explosive shells. Lighter fighters, hit by even small-caliber anti-aircraft fire, would often be crippled or destroyed immediately. The P-47, with its armored cockpit, protected engine, and sturdy construction, could take hits from ground fire and keep fighting. Pilots would return from ground attack missions with their aircraft battered by flak, with holes from 20mm shells, with shrapnel damage scattered across wings and fuselage, and the aircraft would still be flyable. Some Thunderbolts returned from missions with entire cylinders shot off the radial engine, leaking oil and coolant, and still managed to make it back to base. This survivability meant that P-47 units could sustain ground attack operations with acceptable loss rates while maintaining pressure on German forces. Other aircraft types attempting the same missions would have suffered prohibitive casualties. The strategic implications were enormous. The Allies could maintain constant pressure on German ground forces, disrupting operations, destroying supplies, degrading combat effectiveness, all while keeping pilot losses to sustainable levels. During the Normandy invasion in June 1944, P-47s flew close air support missions that were credited with helping to stop German armored counterattacks before they could reach the invasion beaches. German panzer units attempting to move toward the coast found themselves under constant air attack. P-47s would swoop down, bombing and strafing, forcing the panzers to disperse and take cover. Attacks that should have been launched as coordinated armored thrusts instead became piecemeal, disjointed affairs that Allied ground forces could more easily contain. During the breakout from Normandy later that summer, as Allied forces finally punched through German defensive lines and began racing across France, P-47s harried retreating German columns mercilessly. What might have been organized, fighting withdrawals to new defensive positions instead became chaotic routes as air attacks destroyed vehicles, blocked roads, and spread confusion and panic among German forces. The Thunderbolt's ground attack capabilities contributed directly to the speed and success of the Allied advance. In December 1944, when German forces launched their last major offensive in the West, during what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, weather initially aided the German attack. Heavy clouds and fog grounded Allied aircraft, giving German forces freedom of movement that they had not enjoyed in months. For several days, the offensive made genuine progress, catching American forces by surprise and pushing deep into Allied lines. But when the weather cleared on December 23, Allied air power returned with devastating effect. P-47s were among the first aircraft over the battlefield, and they immediately began attacking German columns that had been moving freely during the period of bad weather. Fuel trucks, desperately needed to keep German tanks advancing, exploded under rocket and bomb attacks. Supply vehicles burned. Troops caught in the open were strafed. The German offensive, which had been making progress just days before, ground to a halt under the weight of Allied air superiority. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army during the Battle of the Bulge, sent urgent messages requesting Luftwaffe support to counter Allied air attacks. But the Luftwaffe could not provide meaningful support. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and the overwhelming numerical superiority of Allied air forces meant that German aircraft were simply unable to contest control of the skies. The P-47s, along with other Allied aircraft, attacked German forces with near impunity, and the offensive failed. By early 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany from both west and east, P-47 Thunderbolts were a constant presence in German skies. The aircraft that had been laughed at in 1942 was now an instrument of the Third Reich's destruction. German forces could barely move during daylight hours without facing air attack. Industry was being systematically destroyed by strategic bombing, escorted by fighters including P-47s. Ground forces were being hammered by close air support missions. The Luftwaffe, what remained of it, was unable to mount effective resistance against the waves of Allied aircraft that filled the skies. The final statistics of the P-47 service record tell a story of extraordinary effectiveness. Over 15,000 Thunderbolts were produced during the war, making it the most produced American fighter aircraft. P-47 pilots were credited with destroying nearly 4,000 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, a significant number, though not the highest among Allied fighters. But the ground attack statistics were even more impressive and arguably more important to the outcome of the war. P-47s destroyed over 9,000 locomotives, bringing German rail transport to its knees. They destroyed tens of thousands of rail cars loaded with critical supplies. They destroyed thousands of trucks and other motor vehicles, crippling German logistics. They destroyed hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles. They demolished bridges, fuel depots, ammunition dumps, and countless other targets that were essential to German military operations. The cumulative effect of this destruction was to strangle the German military's ability to sustain operations, contributing significantly to the Reich's ultimate collapse. The technological and tactical lessons learned from the P-47 influenced fighter design and air combat doctrine for decades after World War II. The emphasis on survivability, the recognition that durability mattered as much as speed and maneuverability, the value of heavy armament and extended range, the importance of multi-role capability that allowed a single aircraft type to perform both air superiority and ground attack missions effectively. All of these concepts became standard considerations in post-war fighter development. Modern multi-role fighters, aircraft that can fight for air superiority one moment and strike ground targets the next, owe a direct lineage to the design philosophy that created the P-47 Thunderbolt. Republic aviation proved that unconventional solutions, designs that violated conventional wisdom and challenged established assumptions, could be extraordinarily successful if they were based on clear-eyed analysis of actual operational requirements rather than theoretical ideals. The contrast between the German and American approaches to fighter design revealed fundamental differences in military philosophy. German designers, working within a tradition that valued elegance, efficiency, and technical sophistication, created fighters that were optimized for specific performance parameters. They were beautiful aircraft, marvels of engineering that could perform incredible feats in the hands of skilled pilots. But they were also fragile, limited in range, and often difficult to maintain in field conditions. American designers, particularly Alexander Kartveli and his team, took a more pragmatic approach. They identified the missions that needed to be accomplished and built an aircraft that could accomplish those missions, accepting compromises in areas that mattered less to actual combat effectiveness. The P-47 was not beautiful in the traditional sense. It was not optimized for any single performance parameter, but it was robust, versatile, and effective across a wide range of missions and conditions. This difference in design philosophy reflected broader differences in how Germany and America approached industrial warfare. Germany, with more limited resources and industrial capacity, needed to extract maximum performance from each aircraft, even if that meant accepting higher maintenance requirements and reduced survivability. America, with vast industrial capacity and resources, could afford to build aircraft that were perhaps less theoretically optimal but far more practical in sustained combat operations. The P-47's success also demonstrated the importance of not underestimating opponents, a lesson that military forces throughout history have learned and relearned at terrible cost. The German High Command's initial dismissal of the Thunderbolt was based on reasonable-seeming assumptions about fighter design and performance. But those assumptions were wrong because they failed to account for different priorities and different solutions to the problems of air combat. Göring's laughter in that Berlin briefing room in 1942 symbolized a dangerous arrogance, a belief that German understanding of air warfare was superior and that American efforts to build fighters would inevitably produce inferior results. That arrogance was shattered by the reality of combat, but not before it had contributed to tactical and strategic decisions that cost the Luftwaffe dearly. The P-47 Thunderbolt forced a fundamental reassessment of what made a fighter effective. Speed mattered, but so did durability. Maneuverability mattered, but so did firepower. Theoretical performance in ideal conditions mattered, but so did practical effectiveness in the chaotic, unpredictable reality of combat. The Thunderbolt excelled in the areas that ultimately proved most important to winning the air war over Europe, even though it was not the best fighter in the world by traditional performance metrics. American pilots who flew the P-47 developed deep affection and respect for the aircraft. They gave their Thunderbolts names and painted elaborate nose art on them. They told stories about missions where the P-47 brought them home despite damage that should have been fatal. They trusted the aircraft in ways that went beyond mere professional confidence. That trust translated into aggressive, effective combat tactics that maximized the P-47's strengths. Francis Gabreski, who became one of America's top aces flying P-47s with 28 confirmed victories, always maintained that the Thunderbolt was the finest fighter he ever flew, not because it could outturn a Messerschmitt, which it could not, but because it gave him every advantage he needed to survive and win in combat. It was fast in a dive, it could absorb battle damage, it had devastating firepower, and it had the range to escort bombers deep into enemy territory and still have fuel to fight on the way home. Robert Johnson, who survived that devastating attack that left his P-47 riddled with over 200 holes, flew his entire combat tour in Thunderbolts and never wanted to fly anything else. The aircraft had saved his life, and he knew it. That knowledge created a bond between pilot and machine that transcended mere professional appreciation. The P-47 Thunderbolt didn't just fight in World War II. It defined an era of air combat and established principles that remain relevant in military aviation today. It proved that survivability is not a luxury, but a necessity. It demonstrated that versatility and multi-role capability provide strategic advantages that outweigh optimization for any single mission. It showed that unconventional designs, when based on sound analysis of operational requirements, can revolutionize warfare. The aircraft that German generals laughed at in 1942 became one of the most successful and respected fighters in military history. The flying pig became a thoroughbred. The clumsy heavyweight became a devastating weapon that dominated European skies and struck terror into German forces on the ground. And the lesson it taught, that underestimating an opponent's weapons can lead to catastrophic consequences, remains as relevant today as it was 8 decades ago. The laughter that echoed through the Reich Air Ministry in Berlin died away as the thunder of P-47 engines filled the skies over Europe. And when the war finally ended, when the guns fell silent and the aircraft returned to their bases for the last time, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had earned its place in history not through elegant design or theoretical perfection, but through brutal, proven effectiveness in the most demanding test of all: actual combat against a determined, skilled enemy. If you want to explore more incredible stories of military technology that changed history, stories of weapons that were underestimated, and battles that defied expectations, make sure to hit that like button and let me know in the comments what topic you want covered next. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications because we're diving deep into the true stories behind the weapons, tactics, and turning points that shaped our world. History isn't just about what happened.